Well, welcome everybody to the Citizen Podcast and a very special one here because we get to talk about I think one of the greatest shows that can come to Elk Grove, and that is professional wrestling. That's right. It is One Supreme Night, the anniversary show of SPW, coming on Sunday, April 16th. It's a be there or be square type of event. You got to be there, folks. And I'm planning on being there and bringing some friends, and it's only $15 at the door. And the guy that you're looking at right there that you see is a man who is uh, he if you want to talk pro wrestling, this is the guy who could talk your ear off about it. He knows it all. In fact, I'd like to. His name is George Schire. George, I'm going to real quick share. Um, I got to, let's see here. I want to share the screen if I can. And what I want to do is I want to show first of all our audience uh, the card, and there it is right there. And I don't know if you could see it.
I can see it. Yes, yes.
Yeah, and that is the big one supreme night pro wrestling card. And George, you would appreciate this independent organization, the SPW. They've been going about 23 years here in the Sacramento area. This guy right here is Sir Samurai. This guy here is called the Big Ugly, and they are going to have, and you'd love this, George, a loser leaves town match. Can you
Oh,
believe
wow.
it? Yeah,
Wow.
you remember those type of matches? We don't
I
see much
do.
anymore.
I do. Yeah.
Yeah. But George is here to help us to do something that I really wanted to do is to talk about the wrestling, the history of pro wrestling, and really why organizations like the SPW are so big. This is George's book. It's called Minnesota's Golden Age of Wrestling, from Vern Gagne to the Road Warriors. And I saw these guys wrestle, George, and you did too, over and over and over again. Welcome. Thank you for making the time.
Hey, I love it. And you talking wrestling, you're right. I'll talk your ear off and we can spend the night. Just bring the coffee.
Yeah, yeah. Let's talk, if you don't mind. I would really like for you to tell us about these independent wrestling organizations, wrestling promotions, such as the SPW here in Northern California. How important are they to a wrestler, a guy getting into the business?
Well, if you're talking today, they're very important. And the reason is because it's very few wrestlers that are going to get to the big game, to the WWE or AEW or any of the other bigger promotions. And WWE is the biggest right now.
Mm-hmm.
And there are so few guys, John, that are going to have that dream. And so we are at a point in the business today where these smaller independents, and some of them are very small, working on a shoestring budget and probably losing money. And then there are some that have been, like you said, Supreme Wrestling going for 25 years. Yes, they're thriving and they have some good talent, some good workers. But again, probably every guy that's on that poster that you shared would probably give their right arm to be working at the WWE or AEW or something like that. And the major difference they're so important is because I came from an era where we had just in the United States alone, we had 25, 30, 35 individual territories of professional wrestling back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and into the 80s. And they all had big name stars. I mean, we were talking the cream of the crop of the talent that was available around the country at any given time. And, we could make a list that wouldn't end of the talent that was out there. We're talking mega stars. My era, like the Crusher and the Bruiser and Von Rasky and Nick Bockwinkel, and the list just goes on. And this was all over the country. Well, today, if because these territories are now gone, John,
Mm-hmm.
if one of these indie wrestlers, if they don't get to the big game, the WWE, they have no place to go other than to try to continue to work for the independent in their town. And, we'll be honest, a lot of them aren't making a lot of money. Some of them are probably doing better than others, but certainly they're not making the paydays that the WWE guys are.
Yeah.
And the best way to describe it is indie wrestling has always been around, even in the territorial era. You'd always have, we had Vern Gagne's AWA here, and he owned the market. He had the big cards, but there were little shows here and cards here and there that would pop up. Somebody would promote an indie card with some lesser known talent and even less talented wrestlers. And they would draw, their meager audience. There's always been an audience for pro wrestling, no matter what era we're in. And the best way to describe that is in that territorial day, we had probably 3,000 wrestlers. We're talking the elite that made money. Mm-hmm. They could earn a living. They could support their families. They could buy their homes and cars and live comfortably. And they could travel around when their shtick got burned out in one territory, they could go to another one, change character, change gimmick, whatever it was, and make money. With the territorial system gone, today, I said there were about 3,000, and that didn't count all the undercard guys that worked their way up. Today, if you're not at the WWE level or AEW, Ring of Honor, I don't know if that's still around, and I know there's a couple of others. If you're not in these groups, you really have no place to go other than your local independent wrestling promotion.
Well, and these guys are all wrestling about once to twice a month.
Yeah.
There's a couple of other smaller organizations. There's one over in Petaluma. There's one in the East Bay, the Okerland area. And a lot of the guys that we'll see, on the 16th here in Elk Grove will have wrestled in Petaluma. Last weekend, I believe there was one in the East Bay, a match there. Mm-hmm. So these guys wrestle on the average of about 2 to 3 times a month, which isn't much at all. So that they have other jobs.
Well, that's the whole thing. They have a job that's supporting their family, their needs, their lifestyle, mm-hmm. and the wrestling for them is more at this point a hobby. It's something they enjoy doing, something they'd like to do more, but you got to get in the door. And that's tough to do because, when we had that territorial system, any wrestler that was in any territory, like I said, they could move on. They had a place to go. They could go from Minnesota to Florida territory or go to the Atlanta, or they could go to Texas, and they always had a home. Today, and again, make money doing it. We had probably the best way to describe it is we had undercard wrestlers in the territorial system, and we had guys that were known as jobbers in the business. And for the fans that don't know what a jobber was, that was his job to lose. Yeah, that's what his job was. Well, these guys, I don't know if you remember Kenny J.
Sure. I met him.
Kenny J was a very talented worker, but Kenny J was never going to become in that elite group. And Kenny would wrestle on the weekends. Mm-hmm. And he'd wrestle at the TV studio when they taped the wrestling. Kenny could have had a career, but the problem was that he had a side business, worked a business with his brother, a landscaping business, thus the name Sodbuster Kenny J.
Right.
And that's what he could do. But Kenny wasn't going to make the big money, but Kenny was good. And Kenny would have been one of those guys that when an independent promoter came in and wanted to run a little indie card on the weekend, Kenny J would have been one of their main eventers, because he was known, he was popular, he could work, but he wasn't ever going to be the real big star.
Yeah.
So those kind of guys were always around.
Yeah. those kind of guys, when I grew up watching All-Star Wrestling on television, they were always the first guys announced and always in that one corner of the ring. And there was maybe 50 people in the TV studio. And
Sure.
and they, of course, you're right, they were the jobbers, they were the enhancement talent, they were the
Exactly.
ones that made the star look good. And of course would always lose. Every now and then, though, I remember Steve Regal getting beat by somebody. I think it was
Sure.
Buddy Roberts or somebody like that, on television. Every
Oh,
now
yeah.
and then you get
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, it was just a blast. Cagematch.net, I did a little, is a website that's kind of a database for pro wrestling. I don't know if you're familiar with it. They list 3,200 wrestling promotions, and that's
Active right now.
well known that have existed in the
Oh,
U.S.
oh, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Now,
Well,
Ryan,
that's,
go ahead.
yeah, and that's probably entirely true. I mean, for every big promotion that was around back in the day, there were 10 or 15 smaller promotions that were, getting along. Like I say, some of them making money, some of them just having fun. Somebody pick up. And, in those days, and even today, depending on the inflation, the way you look at it, a guy could go and wrestle and make $20 or $5 or $15. And to him, that was fine. He just wanted to get out there and
Yeah.
do it for 20 minutes at the local arena. So,
Yeah, yeah. I also, when I got into teaching, when I left broadcasting to go into teaching, one of the first classes I taught, and still I'm teaching it every now and then, is called Introduction to Media Studies. And we talk about the history of each form of the mass media, how it got started. When I talk about television, I always say in the late 40s, early 50s, when television was first coming into the American home, what really sold it wasn't necessarily Merle, well, I love Lucille Ball, or uh,
Milton Berle,
Milton Berle. Thank
Milton
you,
Berle,
Milton Berle.
Milton Berle,
Like everybody.
Groucho Marx.
Yeah, Groucho Marx. No,
Yeah,
what really brought a crowd was pro wrestling.
exactly.
What
Yeah,
really brought a crowd to television was
right,
professional wrestling.
right.
And it was very popular. And then, of course, Friday night boxing,
Yeah,
Friday night ringside. And
yeah.
those were what really sold television sets. So, we're talking about a sport that is, and by the way, before we quit, I got to get your opinion of today's wrestling versus, I'll say, pre 1990s wrestling, because
You
today's
really want to
called
know that?
entertainment, huh?
You really want to know that?
No, well, let me put it this way. I've seen you on other wrestling podcasts and I've heard your opinion, and I wouldn't mind you answering it. But you and I grew up, with guys, and I'm going to show you some photos here, and I'm going to have you talk about two or three of these guys here, and I'll share the screen real quick.
Okay.
These were the guys that, at least as a young man growing up in Colorado, they really meant something. And here we go. I'm gonna share these two guys right here. And here we go.
That's actually three guys.
Three guys, excuse
Yep.
me.
Yep.
Yeah, there we go. The Claw Master,
Yep.
Rasky, and the Crusher and the Bruiser.
Right.
And probably my all-time favorite tag team, these guys right here.
Well, they put butts in the seats, John. That's for sure.
Yeah,
And the three guys that you're talking about here, um, regardless of what era wrestling took place in, we always had wrestlers that had gimmicks, or they had some shtick that got them over with the fans. And you take the Baron here. I was around in 1965 or 1966 when Jim Rashke made his professional wrestling debut coming out of Vern Gagne's training camp. And he was Jim Rasky. He was very, very green, as well you'd expect, just coming out of the camp. You know, pro wrestling was now new to him as he's doing the real thing. And his interviews, oh my gosh, if you wanted to go to sleep, listen to Jim Rasky talk. I mean, the man stumbled, very quiet, and he is one of the nicest men in the world. He's one of my friends. I love the Baron. I mean, we're friends. But as Jim Rasky, and he would tell you this too, he was awful. And so he wasn't going to go anywhere in the business if he just stayed a baby face and he just stayed mild-mannered, very low-talking Jim Rasky. And that's when Mad Dog Vachon, it was Mad Dog that kind of worked with him, coerced him into, you know, you should be a German. You know, and Baron says, I am a German.
Yeah, well, he is. He really was.
He turned him into the hated Baron von Raschke and worked with him on his microphone skills and how to project. And he come out with his German accent, you know, as best he could do. And excuse me. And that was in an era in wrestling when wrestling got over because of ethnic personalities, you know, the biases and the hatreds of different countries. And of course, maybe we're there today yet. I don't know. But in wrestling, you know, we always had German villains, Japanese villains, you know, right, and Russian villains. And it was all because of, you know, the previous wars and different things that we'd had. So that Baron got over huge as a Nazi hating, from Berlin, Germany, evil German. And for the, you know, after 1967, when he hooked up with the Dog up in Canada, they became a team and they traveled together. And then Baron went on the road and he was a lot of territories before he came back home here in Minneapolis. And he was still Baron von Raschke, the mean German. And then, of course, in the early 80s, you know, he was starting to slow down on his career and his wrestling skills were lingering. He had multiple little minor health, you know, not health issues, injuries.
Yeah.
And so he became a babyface. And for the era that it worked well, he was now, you know, Baron von Raschke, the good guy. And but yeah, great career. Great.
Yeah. Now I brought up Blackjack Lanza because for years he was a heel, supposedly from, I think for a while he was from Albuquerque, New Mexico, and then went from Laredo, Texas, or someplace. But he actually grew up in Minneapolis. And
yeah, his real name was John Lanza.
Okay.
Just take the A off of Lanza and put an O. But Jack Lanza was trained again by Vern Gagne. And in his earliest matches, he was billed out of Minneapolis as just plain Jack Lanza. And he was young rookie. He was working a lot of the preliminary matches on local cards in the AWA. And he wasn't really going to go anywhere. He was, you know, he was a good guy, but he didn't have a lot of charisma about him. So when he went and grew the mustache and the black hair with the sideburns and, you know, put the black hat on, I should say he did morph into Cowboy Jack for a while as a good guy. White cowboy hat. He was Cowboy Jack. And that's when he was from, Cowboy Jack Lanza was from Albuquerque, New Mexico.
Okay.
And then, but once he got rid of the cowboy thing, turned heel, ended up with Bobby Heenan, which automatically, you know, if you're with Heenan, you're gonna have success. I mean, that's a whole story and a whole show in itself. But Lanza became Blackjack and took off. And of course, he worked Vern's territory. He worked the East Coast when it was WWF as Blackjack Lanza. He was down in Texas. He was out in California. So, I mean, he had a very successful career. And yes, he was Laredo, Texas later on. Yeah.
And then, of course, these two guys, they supposedly were cousins. I don't think they ever were. No. Reggie Lasowski here on the right, better known as the Crusher, and who always took the bombs out of the saloon and swayed the dollies and all this. And then the Bruiser, who became wasn't he one of the based out of Indianapolis? Help me on that.
Yeah. Well, the deal with Dick the Bruiser, let's start with him. I mentioned Vern Gagne giving training to wrestlers. And a lot of people don't know this, but when Dick the Bruiser, Dick Afflis, Richard Afflis, but his real name was William Afflis for those who care. But Richard Afflis, he got his early training for the ring from Vern Gagne and a guy named Joe Pazendak, who had also assisted Vern making his way into the ring, for those that want that history. So it was Vern Gagne who brought Bruiser Afflis, is what he was wrestling at in 1954. And he was a bad guy from the beginning. He had that bully look. In those days, he had a crew cut, kind of barrel chested. He was a bouncer at some of the local bars, and he had played football for the Green Bay Packers. It's funny, when you go to Lambeau Field in Green Bay, they've got a museum and they've got some wrestling questions, and the Bruiser's in a couple of them.
No kidding.
Something for wrestling fans to look at when they go there. But yeah, he played some pro ball. In those days, John, wrestling, playing or doing football, a guy could make $6,000, $10,000 a year playing football. And we're talking back in the 50s and the 60s now.
That's right.
We didn't have these big multi-million-dollar contracts we do today. And Dick says, I can go to wrestling. And he was making in the 50s, moving into the later 50s. Now you got to keep the money in perspective here. Dick all of a sudden was making $50,000, $60,000, $100,000 a year in the late 1950s, early 60s. Now that's big money back then. That's like making $1 million or something today. Okay. So he said, I can, make money in wrestling. And that's the way a lot of those old football player wrestlers, when they were on the off season from football, they would wrestle. Leo Namalini, Wahoo McDaniel, Ernie Ladd, some of those names, those were all football players. And Wilbur Snyder, Gene Kaniski, so many guys played football. So they made more money in wrestling. And the Bruiser got the Dick the Bruiser gimmick. He was just one of those no-nonsense guys, and he'd go in, just kick the crap out of his opponent. It was actually Vern who, even though the two of them, Crusher and Bruiser, had teamed up 3 times previously, but it was Vern in 1963 that dubbed them as cousins and put them together. And in their first match together in the AWA as cousins, they won the AWA tag team title from the hated Russians, Ivan and Kirill Kelmakov.
Oh yeah. If you were a Russian, a Japanese, or a German wrestler, you were guaranteed of getting a round of booze.
Oh yeah.
Which kind of leads me to the next question I have is, we go back into that era of wrestling. It's known as kayfabe.
Yep.
Where we really didn't know these guys' real name, where they really were from. Everything was protected as far as, behind the scenes. But it was part of the magical following, I guess, of wrestling. Now today, wow, I don't know. I will tell you, and I want this because you're the expert on pro wrestling. What turned me away from wrestling after the AWA folded, stopped coming to Denver, basically. I was watching the WCW, and I remember a lot of those guys in the WCW. They were old AWA wrestlers and personalities. And they would sit there with a wireless microphone in the middle of the ring and shout at each other for about 15 minutes. And then they maybe would wrestle for 5 minutes. And I'm thinking, come on, man, shut up. I want to see you wrestle. Let's put the show back in the ring instead of, all this stuff. So I blame the wireless mic for the downturn of professional wrestling. Now, I don't know. I'd like to hear.
Okay. You kind of really made it easy for me to put this together.
Okay.
To describe the kayfabe era to the modern era. The old saying, it's as different as apples and oranges. In this case, it really is, John. What we had back in the kayfabe era, and let me tell you about kayfabe. I was very fortunate that I knew Marty O'Neill early on, the ring announcer, TV announcer here in the cities, and I knew that the finishes, or I knew who was going to win, but I went along with the kayfabe. I never shared it. I mean, when I was in high school, if somebody said you watched that phony stuff, I just walked away from people because it wasn't worth going into.
Yeah.
And I never revealed that I knew something or I knew someone's real name. Like I never would told anybody, well, I know Dr. X is really Dick Beyer and he's a wrestler out of Syracuse and wrestled as the Destroyer. I would have never done that in the day. So I kept kayfabe too. But the real difference is that those TV matches we talked about in the old days, television was designed that you had the jobber against a main event guy. The main event guy was going to beat the jobber in 5 or so minutes. Then the main event guy was going to come out and he was going to have a 2 to 3 minute interview. And the interview was unscripted, John. The wrestler knew the town he was going to be in, who he was wrestling, where he was in the program with the wrestler, you know, what's coming up, you know, they've wrestled 2 times, what this one involves, and the day of the match. And the wrestler had 2 minutes, 3 minutes to sell the fans to go out and buy that ticket. As Marty O'Neill used to say, fans run, don't walk to get your tickets.
I remember
and you
that.
Either hated the guy like a Nick Bockwinkel or a Mad Dog or whoever it was, and they made you so mad at them that you wanted to go to the arena and see them beat. Well, then on the reverse side, you got the calm, collected, as I called them in my book, the Mom's Apple Pie good guys. Vern Gagne comes out, soft-spoken. You know, Marty, this guy thinks he's going to run roughshod. Well, I'm going to wrestle. If he wants to get rough, I'll get rough with him. But, you know, we're going to get him out of the territory. And the fans would be cheering that good guy to take care of that bad guy. That sold tickets. But it was that interview. Now, what happened was when we got to the new era of wrestling, you have your pay-per-views, all this big closed circuit television originally started it. And the wrestlers were no longer, the TV matches were also against good guys, good wrestlers against each other.
Right.
They were put together to try to build a feud or a program between them. The bottom line was you got into these 10 or 15 minute dissertations where they're out there with your wireless mic.
Yeah.
And they're going on and you're like, what are you saying? Get to the point, you know. Excuse me.
Yeah. No, it's okay. No, but let me fill in here. This is where guys like Mean Gene Okerland, who came out of the AWA, you know, Minneapolis, if I remember right, he was had his advertising agency or something like that, and kind of stumbled into pro wrestling and became, you know, one of the most famous of all time. He
was a DJ.
Control the interview a little bit, you know.
Gene Okerland was a radio DJ originally.
Oh, is that what he was? Okay.
Yeah, he worked under the name of Gene Leader.
Okay.
And he was in radio, a DJ back in the top 40 days, which I love. I'm sorry they're gone, but he was a DJ, and then he got into marketing, and he was a marketing director for WTCN TV, which was the outlet at the time for pro wrestling, AWA wrestling.
Right.
And the bottom line is that in 1974, Marty O'Neill was a member of whatever the announcers union or broadcasting union. He was a member of it, and they were on strike. And Marty wasn't going to cross the picket line. And Vern's program was usually taped live on Saturday nights. Marty wasn't going to cross the picket line. And Marty had been the announcer for 20 years. So Vern went to Gene Okerland, who was their marketing director, and he had a radio background. And he said, will you do the show for me tonight?
Right.
Kind of by accident. And they taped a couple of the shows because they used to tape 2-3 shows in a segment, for a couple of weeks out, and then they do tapings for some of the cities. So Gene did that. When Marty came back, he was back at the microphone, and then he was having some heart issues. So Gene was filling in again. Eventually, Marty couldn't do it, and the rest is history. And you're right, Gene was a whole different style than what Marty was. Marty was more the straight man. Gene was more animated and more, come on now, Jesse, getting in the guy's face, or, Marty never did that.
Yeah, that's true.
Marty would just hold the microphone and deliver a line and let the wrestler take it.
Yeah, and he would sell tickets. I remember the little guy like this, holding his microphone up against the huge wrestler.
Well, yeah, when you had Marty O'Neill, who probably with most of the wrestlers, I think Marty was probably about 5'6", 5'7".
Right.
Wasn't a big guy at all, which was great because all the wrestlers were monsters then. Mm-hmm. When you got Tiny Mills picking him up by his tie, well, that makes Tiny hated too, because now the fans want to come to see, picking on poor Marty O'Neill. It all sold tickets.
Yeah, but McMahon, I what he did in raiding the territories and bringing guys to what became the WWE, it's almost like he made some of the guys, almost ruined their careers with some of the characters he had them become. And it just got to be silly, the Red Rooster and all these.
Well, he was, like I said earlier, wrestling always had some gimmicks.
Yeah.
We always had wrestlers. I mean, Wahoo McDaniel was a gimmick. The whole Indian regalia. I mean, he did have Native American blood in him, but Edward McDaniel, I mean, you put the Wahoo in front of it, and you wear the big fancy headdress and the dance and it was a gimmick, but he could really work. See, that was the good thing. Wahoo was one tough SOB. Man, you didn't want to mess with that guy. I mean, I'm serious.
Yeah.
It wasn't that he was the greatest wrestler in the world, but you get in his face, he's going to pop you.
Yeah.
And you're going to feel it.
Where I'm really starting to run out of time, George, for this. But this has been great to be able to.
We got to plan about 12 days.
What's that?
12 days we need to do this.
Yeah, no kidding. I just really, for our local people here in Elk Grove, I want to go one more time back to the wrestling card that's coming up on the 16th at Soccer World. It's an indoor soccer arena, George.
I see that.
Yeah, it's kind of an interesting venue. They call it One Supreme Night. There's going to be a lot of wrestlers on this card. This is their champion, a guy named Jekyll's. Unique. Let me just put it that way. A unique.
The one with the belt right in front of him.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. Yeah. He's a unique one. Guy named Joseph Rodriguez is his real name. I guess I shouldn't be revealing these guys' name,
oh, geez, come on. It'll get out. It's kayfabe is dead.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So all these guys are and gals, this is Eliza Hammer.
Sure.
I will tell you, this is Myra, who will be her opponent.
Okay.
She is actually one of our local paramedics. And
really? Okay.
Yeah. And spends her weekends in the ring. Let's put it that way. So I encourage our listeners to head on to get your tickets. You can get them online, and the SPW website is, I believe it's supremeprowrestling.com. And George, it's a lot of fun. As I said earlier, the loser leaves town match between Big Ugly and Sir Samurai. Mm-hmm. Last time I saw them wrestle, I had flashbacks of Billy Robinson and Vern Gagne.
Wow.
In the ring. I mean, they were that was the kind of, it wasn't this slug guys, throw them around, sure. Fly off the top ropes. It wasn't that. It was the kind of wrestling we were we came up with in the old AWA. So yeah, listen, I want to thank you so much, George, for
My pleasure. My
yeah,
pleasure. And
yeah,
let's do it again. Just if you
yeah.
just want to chat, I always love it.
Yeah, Amazon. I would encourage you, if you're a wrestling fan, to go to Amazon and get a copy of his book. Even though it's called the Minnesota Golden Age of Wrestling, it covers a lot of guys that are well known across the country in pro
The
wrestling.
quick story on that, John, is it's
Yeah.
Minnesota's golden age, but it covers the AWA because of all of the talent. But the reason
Right.
it has Minnesota in the title is that was because it's published by the Minnesota Historical Society in St. Paul, Minnesota. And the History Center wanted Minnesota in the title.
Yeah, well,
That's the reason that is.
Yeah, it's great. It got a lot of great photographs in there, and
Wow.
really it's a great piece. All right, George, thank you so much.
My pleasure. Good luck with the card. I hope they sell.